It was August 9th, 1965. A small island surrounded by giants was suddenly kicked out of the very country it wanted to belong to. Singapore didn't fight for independence, it was forced into it. Lee Kuan Yew, the man who led the island, stood on live television, his eyes filled with tears as he said the words no leader ever wants to say. For me, it is a moment of anguish. All my life, my whole adult life, I believed in merger with Malaysia. And just like that, Singapore was on its own, with no water, no resources, no army, and no friends. The world expected it to collapse within months, but instead, it became a miracle. Today, that same island is richer than Malaysia, more powerful than many of its neighbors, and respected by nations far larger than itself. So, how did Singapore rise from rejection to global admiration? Let's travel through the decades from that tearful day in 1965 to the unstoppable city-state you see today. In the early 1960s, Southeast Asia was a region in flux. Nations were finding independence, borders were redrawn, and ideologies clashed. Amid all this uncertainty, one small island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula dreamed of unity and stability. That island was Singapore. In 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia. For its leaders, especially Lee Kuan Yew, this was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. A partnership that would bring economic strength, security, and a shared national identity. After all, both were connected by culture, trade, and history. It seemed logical. But what began with handshakes and smiles soon turned into a relationship poisoned by mistrust. Singapore's population was majority Chinese, while Malaysia's ruling elite, dominated by ethnic Malays, feared that this new addition would tip the country's ethnic balance. The Malaysian government introduced policies favoring the Malay majority known as Bumiputra policies to protect their political dominance. Lee Kuan Yew, however, had a different vision. He pushed for Malaysian Malaysia, a nation where all citizens, regardless of race, were equal. It was a bold idea and a dangerous one. Tensions rose fast. Political battles turned personal. The Malaysian leadership saw Lee's rhetoric as a threat, while Singapore's leaders began feeling cornered. Racial riots broke out in 1964. Chaos filled the streets of Singapore as Malays and Chinese clashed violently. The dream of unity was collapsing, and the experiment of merger was dying. Then, on August 9th, 1965, the unimaginable happened. Without a referendum, without even a warning to its people, Malaysia expelled Singapore. The Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, declared that separation was the only solution. Singapore was officially out. When Lee Kuan Yew addressed the nation that day, his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Tears welled in his eyes as he said, "For me, it is a moment of anguish, because all my life I believed in merger and unity." That image, Lee Kuan Yew in tears on national television, became one of the most powerful moments in modern Asian history. It wasn't just a political separation, it was a national heartbreak. And when the cameras stopped rolling, the harsh reality hit. Singapore was alone. It had no natural resources, no army, no foreign reserves, and no water supply of its own. It depended entirely on Malaysia for that. Unemployment was rising, housing was scarce, and the world doubted whether the island could even feed its own people. Most nations expected Singapore to collapse within months. Some foreign newspapers described it as a city destined to disappear. But what no one realized then was that this forced independence, this survival by force, would ignite one of the greatest transformations in modern history. Singapore had lost everything except one thing: its will to survive. When the celebrations of independence ended, reality hit harder than anyone imagined. Singapore was technically free, but freedom didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a sentence. The new nation had no army to defend itself, no natural resources to export, and almost no foreign currency reserves. Unemployment hovered around 14%, and thousands were living in overcrowded, unsafe slums. The world wasn't paying attention, and the few who didn't believe this tiny island could make it. But Lee Kuan Yew refused to let Singapore die quietly. He gathered a small group of visionaries, Goh Keng Swee, the economic strategist, S. Rajaratnam, the idealistic diplomat, and several others who would become the architects of modern Singapore. They all shared one mission: survival. Lee was brutally realistic. He once said, "We are not supposed to exist, but since we do, let's make it count." The first challenge was jobs. Without jobs, there could be no stability. So Goh Keng Swee turned his eyes to the West, to companies that were expanding across Asia. If Singapore couldn't grow its own economy, it would invite others to build one for it. He built the Economic Development Board and began a global campaign to attract multinational corporations. His message was clear and clever. Singapore is small, but it's stable. We have no corruption, no strikes, and we are open for business. To make that promise real, the government created industrial estates, the first being Jurong, a swampy wasteland that critics mocked as a white elephant. But soon, smoke rose from factory chimneys, jobs appeared, hope returned. Meanwhile, Lee Kuan Yew tackled the country's fragile social fabric. The 1964 riots were still fresh in memory. Singapore couldn't afford another ethnic divide. So he built a system based on meritocracy, not race. Every citizen, regardless of background, would have a fair chance if they worked hard enough. Then came housing, one of Lee's biggest obsessions. He believed people would only defend what they owned. So through the Housing and Development Board, he launched a massive public housing program. Within a decade, over half of Singaporeans had moved into clean, affordable apartments. That wasn't just urban development, it was nation building. But even as the city started to breathe again, there was another existential problem: defense. Singapore had no army, and in a region where coups and invasions were common, that meant danger. So the government sought help and found it in an unexpected place: Israel. Israeli military advisors came secretly to train Singapore's first soldiers, laying the foundation of the Singapore Armed Forces. It was a bold, calculated move, one that showed how far Lee was willing to go to protect his new nation. By the late 1960s, factories were running, ships were docking, and the streets were safer. Singapore hadn't yet become rich, but it had built something far more important: discipline, order, and belief. The island had stopped waiting for miracles. It was engineering one. While the rest of the world still pitied Singapore, the island had already stopped crying. It was too busy building its future. By the early 1970s, the world began to notice something strange happening on that tiny island at the edge of the Malacca Strait. Singapore, once written off as a failed experiment, was suddenly booming. The factories in Jurong were no longer symbols of desperation. They were churning out electronics, textiles, and ship parts for the global market. Cargo ships filled its harbors, and foreign investors began whispering something once unthinkable: Singapore works. But this was not an accident, it was a system built by design. Lee Kuan Yew's government wasn't chasing quick success. It was laying foundations that would last generations. The strategy was simple yet revolutionary: political stability plus economic openness plus zero corruption equals trust. That formula became Singapore's greatest export. The government maintained strict control, but it used that control not for power, for progress. Ministers were paid competitive salaries to reduce corruption. Laws were enforced with surgical precision, and the bureaucracy, instead of slowing things down, became one of the most efficient in the world. Meanwhile, Go Kang Sui shifted the economy from low-wage manufacturing to high-value industries. Singapore began producing electronics, petrochemicals, and precision engineering components. Its education system was reformed to match this shift. Schools started training students not just to read and write, but to compete globally. By the 1980s, Singapore wasn't just an industrial hub, it was becoming a financial capital. The government established the Monetary Authority of Singapore to regulate banking and finance, and soon international banks set up headquarters in the city. Skyscrapers replaced slums, and the once silent port became one of the busiest in the world. And then came the masterstroke, sovereign wealth. Instead of spending all its growing income, Singapore began saving it. It created Temasek Holdings in 1974 and GIC, Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, in 1981. Their mission? To invest the nation's money globally and secure its future. This was unheard of in the developing world. While other nations borrowed, Singapore invested. While others printed money, Singapore printed results. By the 1990s, Singapore had transformed itself from a swampy island to a first-world metropolis. Its GDP per capita had surpassed that of most of its Asian neighbors, even its former partner, Malaysia. And yet, Lee Kuan Yew remained unsatisfied. He warned, "The moment we think we have arrived, we are finished." That mindset, restless, hungry, and disciplined, became part of the Singaporean DNA. The country built Shanghai Airport, Singapore Airlines, and Marina Bay not just as infrastructure, but as symbols of national pride and global competence. It was no longer about survival. It was about proving that a nation with no resources could beat those that had everything. Singapore's rise wasn't luck, it was precision, and behind that precision was a system so disciplined and so controlled that it would shape every part of life in the decades to come. By the 1990s, Singapore had achieved what no one thought possible. From a city with open sewers and unemployment, it had become one of the cleanest, safest, and most efficient countries on earth. But behind that transformation was a philosophy, the Singapore model. Lee Kuan Yew didn't want Singapore to be rich by chance. He wanted it to be rich by design. That meant engineering not just the economy, but the people themselves. From the very beginning, Lee believed that discipline was more powerful than democracy, and order was more important than freedom. His logic was simple. Chaos destroys small nations. So Singapore built itself on three pillars: meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. In this system, success wasn't about where you came from, it was about what you could deliver. Corruption was crushed with zero mercy, bureaucracy was streamlined, every law, every rule, every policy served one purpose: to make Singapore efficient. And it worked. The streets were spotless, crime was nearly non-existent, trains ran on time, schools produced some of the smartest students in Asia, and businesses knew that every contract signed in Singapore was backed by law and integrity. But this order came with a cost. Critics called it a nanny state. They said Singapore traded personal freedom for collective success, banning chewing gum, fining litterers, and maintaining strict control over the press. Yet, Lee Kuan Yew didn't flinch. His answer was blunt. If Singapore is a nanny state, then I'm proud to have fostered a generation that can stand on its own feet. And indeed, it did. Singapore didn't just build a functioning society, it built a culture of excellence. Students competed fiercely in schools, civil servants worked with military precision, and innovation became the new national weapon. The government launched initiatives to turn Singapore into a smart nation. Digital governance, data-driven policies, and smart infrastructure began shaping everyday life. Public transport, urban planning, and healthcare became models the world studied and tried to copy. At the same time, Singapore evolved into a global hub for aviation, banking, shipping, and diplomacy. It positioned itself between the East and West, neutral, trustworthy, and stable. Today, it ranks among the world's richest nations per capita, with one of the lowest crime rates and most efficient governments. But what truly makes Singapore powerful is not its wealth, it's its mindset. It's a country that refuses to relax, a nation that treats progress as a daily ritual. And yet, even after all this success, Singapore faces a question that every great empire once faced. Can it keep this miracle alive forever? Today, when you look at Singapore's skyline, the glowing towers, the spotless streets, the calm precision of everything, it's hard to believe this was once a country left to die. From being kicked out in humiliation to becoming one of the most admired nations in the world, Singapore's story is nothing short of extraordinary. But behind every skyscraper, every clean street, and every efficient system lies the vision of one man, Lee Kuan Yew. He didn't just lead a country, he sculpted it, brick by brick, policy by policy, habit by habit. He turned discipline into destiny. He took a nation that had nothing and convinced its people that they were enough. When Lee Kuan Yew passed away in 2015, millions lined the streets in silence, not just mourning a leader, but paying respect to the man who refused to give up on them. His message was simple yet eternal. We have built a nation. Now we must defend it, not with weapons, but with our will. That willpower is what keeps Singapore alive today. Of course, new challenges loom: an aging population, slowing growth, and rising living costs. Some wonder if the next generation can sustain the discipline and unity that built this miracle. But history suggests that Singapore's greatest strength has never been its size, its money, or its influence. It's been its mindset. A mindset that believes progress isn't a destination, it's a duty. From the tears of 1965 to the triumphs of today, Singapore has proven that greatness doesn't come from resources, it comes from resilience. And maybe that's why the world still looks at this tiny island with a mix of awe and disbelief. Because Singapore didn't just rise, it rewrote the rules of what a small nation can be. So the next time you hear that a country is too small to matter, remember this story of a nation that was kicked out, counted out, and still climbed to the top. In 1965, Singapore was told it wouldn't survive. Today, it teaches the world how to. And if you think that separation was dramatic, wait till you hear why Malaysia actually kicked out Singapore Go. That story is even more shocking, and you can watch it right now by clicking on the video showing up on your screen. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button.